Okay, so today we'll be looking at this is a regular sort of iteration of the Social Journal Club. Social is the UK psychedelic network for industry, and I'm guest leading this episode. Thank you kindly to Alex Pappenheim Adams for granting me the opportunity to do this. Um, we are going to be focusing on chronic immunological and neurological diseases. And I put underneath that this is a CIND psychedelic symposium because I really don't think whilst there has been some really interesting research in this area internationally, in the US, we've seen some from Germany and also here in the UK. I think I'm yet to see any concerted international collaboration around this. So I thought this was a really nice opportunity to try and get a few more researchers involved and people engaged with this topic. And yeah, so a very good question you might be asking is, what are CINDs? Chronic immunological and neurological disorders. And the the short answer is the research is still nascent. Our understanding of this area is quite juvenile, and there's a lot more work to do. But um, the characterization of CINDs is that they involve dysfunctions in the immune, neurological, and nervous systems, and they have been um, they're typically post-infectious, malaria, Lyme disease, glandular fever, COVID-19, as some of you will have heard from myself. Um, but they can also be autoimmune. They can be post-concussive, genetic, or idiopathic, i.e., uh, of unknown origin. So I've just put some key examples up there. That's ME, which is myalgic encephalomyelitis, which I should get an award for pronouncing correctly. And long COVID, of course, fibromyalgia, which is one of the most common co-occurring symptoms of long COVID and post-viral fatigue, and in general characterizes many of these conditions, including Lyme disease and post-concussion syndrome, namely um, cognitive impacts, cognitive and physical fatigue, and neuropathic pain, of which fibromyalgia is one of those. Is the technical name for that. So I just thought I would show that this is not sort of the first time in modern history that we've come across such a big cohort of post-viral patients. Going back to 1919, 1918, 1919, there was the international Spanish flu post-World War One, as suddenly the world saw a greater in migratory patterns than it had seen for potentially ever. And this led to the resulting post-viral impact of this, as well as obviously the vast amount of as well as obviously the vast amount of uh, death that was experienced post-Spanish flu were famines in Africa, particularly in then South Africa, now Tanzania, which led to a famine in the region due to such a large post-viral cohort. And finally, I just on CINDs themselves, I wanted to talk about the urgency for treating them. So this relates to two areas: prevalence and underfunding. In terms of prevalence, long COVID is, as you can see from the graph, is one of the most burdensome diseases in the US, measured in disability adjusted life years, which is the econometric used by the World Health Organization to to ascertain what the disabling burden of various conditions. So you will be able to see you'll be able to see the pointer. Okay, it's not letting. Is it gonna let me do the pointer? Yes, it is going to let me do a pointer. Uh, go for it, Steve.
I'm really sorry as well. I was extending my screen.
Oh, no worries.
I'm so
We've all been there. We've all been there.
sorry,
So
man.
yeah, so this ME/CFS post-viral conditions here is pre-pandemic, where there was already a substantial population. Now, post-pandemic, it is obviously this is not an exhaustive graph, but um, by this metric would appear to outweigh things like Alzheimer's, stroke, diabetes. So a really significant impact, and that may not be due to necessarily due to the severity, although the condition is can be very severe. It can even lead to death, and 1 in 4 patients with ME are housebound, but also due to the prevalence. So we know that 1.3 million people in the UK are likely to have ME. Previously, pre-pandemic, there was about 200,000. So that sort of gives a bit of an explanation of why this order of magnitude jump pre-pandemic to post-pandemic. As I mentioned before, there's this, again, like with Spanish flu, there's suddenly this very big post-viral cohort. Okay. So, um, moving on to just why psychedelics might be an interesting avenue of approach for treating this class of diseases. And that's particularly because they're characterized by neurological sequelae, sequelae being any symptom that continues post an original infection. So we're talking about, again, things like brain fog, cognitive fatigue, and yeah, and other potential ramifications that are derived from that. So the reporting on neurological sequelae has started to be much more widespread in 2024. Bloomberg spoke about COVID's impact on the brain, and this includes people who don't have long COVID. The claim was made that every subsequent COVID infection leads to a 3-point IQ drop. So since entering, I'm guessing most people have caught COVID on this call once at least, and therefore I'm sorry if I have described you as stupider or you feel stupider than when you entered the call, but there's science to it. So Scientific American also did a fantastic review of this, and this has started to be reflected in uh, scientific research as well. And in fact has been sort of an understanding for a long time in the field, but it has only started to be taken more seriously in terms of its neurological impacts more recently. And then the other rationale for addressing the CINDs in this journal club is that there are now some really exciting case studies that indicate some potential positive um, results from taking psychedelics on people's long COVID. With the disclaimer that, because I know that there might be some people on this call who have long COVID, and who there might be some people on the call who have long COVID. Unfortunately, I can't access my notes on this presentation. But I have a quote from a researcher basically saying that whilst this is a really exciting hypothesis, there is the potential that if one is in the particularly acute phase of a CIND, that psychedelics might not be suitable and might even exacerbate their condition. So this please don't take this call as an endorsement of taking this journal club as an endorsement of taking substances outside of therapeutic settings. but hopefully we can explore the really exciting science behind this area of research. So the first case study I'm gonna just bring up is so so this was so slightly just a preamble to the case studies. These these there was some initial reporting quite early on in the I characterize 2023 as being quite early on in long COVID research because it's only really in the last 2 years that things have kicked off. There's also been discussion. So we've got Time magazine discussing the potential curative nature of psychedelics. Also was referenced in this BBC Future article, and finally in this really great piece from Salon, which speaks to the fact that we don't have conclusions yet, but there are some really interesting possibilities. So the first paper that we're going to sort of consider is um, the therapeutic potential of psilocybin for treating neuropsychiatric long COVID symptoms. A Reddit investigation, which is not necessarily the most robust piece of research, and we'll be delving into um, more specific research later on. But I thought that this is a really interesting way of just establishing that there is some potential, that there is potential being displayed in academic contexts, as you'll see from the second paper as well. Long COVID symptoms improved after MDMA and psilocybin therapy. As I mentioned, I can't get my notes up at the moment, but um, from memory, the the sustained benefit in therapeutic potential of psilocybin, a Reddit investigation was 77%, with 11% experiencing adverse effects. So it wasn't all positive, but there was a significant benefit seen in this investigation. The second one, long COVID symptoms improved after MDMA and psilocybin therapy. A case report includes a really, really interesting um, protocol. No need to remember all of this. I'll be distributing the slides and notes later. Um, and that can be seen here. And so moving on to basically our first discussion, I um I will so I've included a list of the potential mechanisms of action. So that it's basically strong anti-inflammatory effects, um, encouraging neuroplasticity to correct maladaptive neuronal pathways, particularly potentially in the case of fibromyalgia and pain. And I believe James Close is very kindly going to present on that in a bit more detail for our next paper. And also the potential reduction in the default mode network activity. The default mode network being a collection of regions in the brain that psychedelics are known to act on, that often tied to sense of self um, and perception of external stimuli, and are therefore very intimately tied to the body's autonomic nervous system, the system that governs all the automatic functions in the body, like heart rate, blood pressure, respiratory rate, homeostasis. And are typically out of whack, known as dysautonomia. So when just before we go into breakout rooms, because there's 14 of us, and I think that's a bit too many to do just together. Um, we're gonna have I've put some key questions here as well. And whilst I sort out the breakout rooms, do have a read of those and I think whilst I get this sorted. Okay. So I cannot figure out how to do breakout rooms, but I have an alternative solution. I would encourage people to share their thoughts, but I'm going to allow people to unmute and share their thoughts, but I'm going to also put up an to I'm going to put up a way for to share people's thoughts. Um, Okay, righty. Right. So I now have shared a little interactive piece for people to discuss what they think are the most plausible mechanisms behind any improvements reported. Um, Again, this works by just typing in the chat, and this works by typing in the chat and suggesting what um, what might be the relevant applications. But please do feel free to also unmute and share these. So neuroinflammation was one of them.
It made me think of Charles Nichols, the
I don't.
sort. Yeah, he's well, he's a chemical researcher. Researches compounds, etc. I'll chuck in his paper about anti-inflammation, but it's rather romantic. But I think but when he did the asthma research, he found that the mescaline he was using worked on 5-HT2A receptors in the heart, in the soft tissue, which is, like you mentioned, autonomous function. And that because soft tissue is it electrified? I mean, there's probably someone on this call know better about that kind of thing than I would. Um, and so, by with cognitive mechanisms only are we slightly restricting ourselves. And then again, with 4E cognition, what is cognition anyway? Is it not in the body as much as in the brain?
Yeah,
Uh,
that
my specialist area is cognitive, but by the way, so not a rubbish cognitive psychology at all.
that I mean that's really please do share that paper on. Did you say that there was some it was pulmonary there were five to
Yeah, in the
eight.
soft tissue in the heart. It sounds like
Yeah, yeah.
you've got the window better than I have. Let me just try and dig it out. But Charles Nichols, you probably recognize him if you saw him. I'm not quite sure if this is the paper with. Not quite sure if that is the paper with the asthma. But I think he claims that there's a isolated molecule in mescaline. Interestingly, not a psychedelic molecule that works on 5-HT2A receptors on soft tissue in the heart, or it did in rats, and therefore treats asthma significantly better than Ventolin.
Oh,
100% sure that's the paper with the rats and the asthma.
interesting. Vaishnavi's actually shared a another paper. It might be the same one. On
Yeah, I
on.
think this might be the one that you're talking about. I think it's an asthma model in mice, and it was talking about basically the effect on different inflammatory markers as well. And this kind of being some suggestion that 5-HT2A agonists are reducing the amount of inflammation in the body.
Interesting. And
Yeah, totally, that's the one. Well done.
yeah, yeah, I don't know whether anyone has any thoughts or expertise on. I don't know whether anyone has any thoughts or expertise on specifically neuroinflammation, because what I find really interesting about that is that obviously, whilst we have certain classes of anti-inflammatories that might be considered effective for things like long COVID, etc., often they don't cross the blood-brain barrier in the way that psychedelics do, or things like cannabis do. And and the difference that I've heard when speaking, I spoke to Court Wing, who was the one who he firstly he's CEO of Remap Therapeutics, so and they specialize in treating chronic pain. But he arranged with Dr. Monica Gutierrez to publish this case report on long COVID and psychedelics. Dr. Gutierrez is one of the leading is a leading long COVID scientist in the US whose specialism is not it is rehabilitative medicine and not psychedelics. Um, and when I spoke with him about this, his perspective was that as opposed to sort of traditionally quite strong anti-inflammatories, psychedelics are more immunomodulatory, inflammatory modulators, rather than solely being uh, reducing an inflammation. They actually sort of, and I can't remember I have some notes on the mechanism, but I can't remember specifically to do with this, but um, may potentially. I don't know what other people think about this, but potentially by rewiring the DMN and and acting on those parts of the brain, um, it will it will it will it will recharacterize the body's processing of external stimuli, of external fear stimuli, etc. So yeah, I don't know whether other people, sorry, I've just got a notice that I need to get upgrade my Zoom. Um, Hence slightly slower response on that bit. But I don't know whether other people have any thoughts on the neuroinflammatory element, and what I just said about modulation rather than just depression of existing inflammation. Yeah. If not, then I'm going to suggest that we move on to the next paper, and I am going to, in fact, yes, I'm going to hand over to James to present. And whilst you do that, James, I'm going to figure out extending our meeting time.
Yeah, thanks, Jordan. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah,
Yeah. I did have a slide here that I can share with you. Thank you for hosting today.
thank you so
Um,
much for joining.
I'm going to uh, share what I've got in front of me here. Let's try that again. Yeah, so can you see that there? Can you see my slide?
Yep.
Um, Thanks.
Psilocybin for fibromyalgia
Yeah,
is what I
lovely.
see on
Yeah,
the screen.
good. Thank you. Yeah, so I'll be very quick, just sort of 4 or 5 minutes to, and then if you have any questions after that. But yeah, it does, like you say, this kind of fits under this same category that you have highlighted there. um, as this sort of almost idiopathic, chronic central sensitivity syndromes. Um, there are some interesting overlaps here with immunological function in fibromyalgia, and in inflammatory processes that happen with fibromyalgia. But much like all of these chronic idiopathic diseases, there's lots of overlap. So, like you said, fibromyalgia and long COVID, and chronic fatigue syndrome, they often come together in this kind of this kind of batch, and that can be um, put down to genetics in some cases, but the thought is that they have a common underlying sort of neurological mechanism there, and some of that might be immunological, but there's other thoughts around the way that the brain functions as well. And so we did this study, Imperial. It's almost like a pilot study, a feasibility study. It's on 20 people with fibromyalgia, and we ran it. It ended sort of last year, and we've been just processing some of the data ever since. For those who don't know anything about fibromyalgia, it's mainly characterized by pain, chronic widespread pain all over the body. Um, but there also has, this chronic fatigue element, these difficulty concentrating, so cognitive issues, issues with sleep as well. So again, lots of these symptoms you'll see shown in some of the chronic neurological disorders, long concussion syndrome, long COVID, they're all there. And like I said, I don't think that's any coincidence. I think it points to these underlying mechanisms, perhaps, at play. Yeah, so we wanted to, it was primarily a study to look at how brain function as in response to psilocybin. And so we did some fMRI and EEG on these individuals before, during, and after a psilocybin dose and a placebo dose. And this was our study design here, that they came to the hospital in total 3 times. The first time we took some baseline measures, gave them a placebo, and took their EEG measurements while they had this sort of placebo in a sort of psychological supported environment. And then the next day we took more measures, and then we did the same thing 4 weeks later, except this time with 25 milligrams of psilocybin, and doing sort of MRIs, sort of various intervals in between as well. And so we got some really good positive outcomes. Of course, this was it's a single arm study, so the patients knew that they'd get some psilocybin at some point. They didn't know what they'd get in the first session, but it was single blinded. It wasn't double blinded. It was a single arm, so it wasn't randomized. So very much a preliminary sort of feasibility study. The next step beyond this would be to do a much larger scale kind of randomized control trial and have 2 arms with placebo and psilocybin, or crossover study or something. So so that has some limitations on the inferences we can take from this as well. But we saw generally some really fantastic improvements in pain, significant improvements, clinically meaningful improvements over the course of the study. Pain severity, pain interference, pain severity is, rating your pain out of 10. Pain interferences rate how much the pain interferes with your daily activity. And here you can see them stacked on top of each other. So to point out pain severity here, you can see where, the gray line would be placebo. The orange line here is psilocybin, and you can see there's sort of significant differences in the drop. Interestingly, that there are a small drop in pain after the placebo dose. As we know, pain is very sensitive to placebo, and a lot of placebo research is done in pain. But at least in this study, we were able to show significant improvements beyond placebo, lasting longer than 4 weeks. And the same with pain interference there as well. Um, and then all of the other sort of standard things you'd expect. So mental health improvements. Obviously, a lot of the research has been shown in mental health. This is the SF-36, and we can see there 4 weeks after the dosing, we see a significant shift in their SF-36 scores as well. And here are some other scores, sort of exploratory measures we did. Again, this is over the whole course of the study, so not compared with placebo, but we can see depression, anxiety scores shifting. Yeah, and a few more other exploratory scores there. Most of the clinical scores we did came out showing sort of positive, significantly positive change in the direction we'd want to see as well. So overall, positive clinical scores there. Yeah, and then in terms of our EEG measures, we can see that um, uh, the amount of what we have this metric called limpal Z complexity. So this is essentially a measure of how much entropy there is in the brain, how complex the signals are in the brain, and we did this we've seen in our other studies that the amount of complexity correlates directly with the clinical scores and the clinical improvements. Um, and we can see there, when given the psilocybin, there's a significant difference in signal complexity, and all of these complexity scores correlate with clinical improvements. And that's actually what led, well, our chief investigator, Robin Carhart-Harris, wrote a couple of papers about this and came up with this thing called the entropic brain hypothesis, and eventually sort of led him to integrate that with his rebus theory, which is about relaxed beliefs and relaxed priors in the brain as a result of psychedelics. So we think this has something to do with the improvements and why people improve as well. This is the rebus paper that Robin published back in 2019. I think it still holds. These are we see this top down, this shift in top down, a relaxation in top down prediction errors. Yeah. So without going into a huge amount of detail, um, you know, the amount of the neurological pathways and beliefs that we hold can become very entrenched, particularly in clinical disorders like depression. And I expect we'd find the same with these neurological disorders. And what we see with psychedelics is that they allow for a reforming of these neural pathways and beliefs, sort of a window of reformation. So I suppose we can extrapolate this to immunological, and like you're saying, immune function. If we work on the assumption that immune function is perhaps controlled partly from the top down as well, from the pituitary gland, from from the midbrain, has a direct control over immune function and how body's immune function is working. We could conceivably integrate that into this theory here. Yeah. And that's just a little figure there. Mustn't forget the psychological and psychiatric improvements and the bidirectional nature of those with physical function and physical changes there as well. So, you know, stress related depression, we see these bidirectional relationships between depression, stress, cortisol levels, and inflammation and immune function. So there's a triangle there perhaps that might help explain some of these things. Lovely. I'm going to stop sharing now. Stop talking.
Yeah, that was fantastic, James. So interesting. I have about a million questions. I'll give you one or two, but please, others do think of some as well. And then once we've finished discussing, I'll throw this open to the floor. Um,
Mm.
yeah, I mean, just straight off the bat, what placebo did you guys use?
So we didn't use an active comparator. We literally used it was microcrystalline cellulose, so it was completely inert placebo. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, which again is, we could use potentially use a different placebo. We just had this conversation today in our lab meeting about using active placebos, using we used a certain amount of deception for the participants. They had no idea what they'd get and when they the way we phrased things it meant that they could be receiving a lower dose of psilocybin in the first session. So there's that. But yeah,
Yeah,
um,
that's really interesting. I know that the way Compass are going about doing these things are that they are doing different levels of dosage to try and establish impact. I've heard of, I think I shared an article with Vaishnavi about some really interesting approaches to trying to double blind. I don't know, I don't know whether the non-researchers like myself would be surprised to hear that there is some sort of trying to think of the right word, deception or malarkey, I can't think of a better word, involved in running these trials because it's so hard to placebo for something like psilocybin, which is such a unique experience. Uh, yeah. I mean, the other thing, and I'd invite others to to type any questions, comments they have in the chat. Sorry, Helena, I noticed I missed yours on NMD NDMA receptors last time, but that was another great point. But yeah, please put those in the chat if you have any. The thing that um leapt out to me was about nociplasticity. But I mentioned to you, James, I think I shared this with you that I participated in a study at King's in nerve fiber neuropathy, which identified significant shifts in nociceptor populations, nociceptor, those being the uh, neurons that transmit pain.
Mm,
And what was noted was that there was a proliferation in type 1B mechanoinsensitive nociceptors, which lead to pain that is not triggered by like kinetic impact. And that I think gets to a really, really interesting aspect of CINDs, which is clearly there is something neurological going on, and clearly at the same time that people's um, quality of life and symptom severity is is dramatically affected. It is affected by external stimulus, stress, um, like depression, which is also potentially caused by these viral infections, as it is in post-concussion syndrome. And what we're seeing here is that whether there is a physiological or a psychological cause, there certainly is a physiological ramification in the body that there is this population shift of the type of pain receptors that we have in the body. Obviously, this is a lay explanation. I don't have a neurology specification, but this is my interpretation of the research. And for the last interesting conclusion on that um, was that those long COVID patients were demonstrating similar pain receptor population shifts to fibromyalgia patients, which again sort of speaks to that coherent thread running through CIND research. Okay. I was going to sort of take us onto a third paper, but I think I'm just going to talk through it quickly, and then sort of and wrap this up. Um, I'll be sharing the presentation so people can focus on this further. We spoke about neuroinflammation, we spoke about neuroplasticity, and we've spoken about the default mode network. What we sort of haven't spoken about is serotonin deficiency. And there's this really great paper that I've got here, which speaks to the reduction in circulating serotonin levels in long COVID patients. And I think we can presume that this is applicable to other ME patients and potentially Lyme disease and post-malaria and post-concussion. And I think I've definitely heard of this being the case in post-concussion syndrome as well. And that this can also potentially have effects gastrointestinally, so the autonomic system, as well as governing heart rate, blood pressure, respiratory rate, also covers digestion. And there's this really fantastic researcher in Ireland called John Kelly um, who's at Trinity College Dublin, who's done a really interesting piece of work on the psilocybin. I should have practiced pronouncing that before. The details will be on the slide. Lastly, there are also some honorable mentions of some papers that haven't been discussed, but have some really interesting implications. Again, available later. And I think this just leaves me to say a big thank you to everyone who's shown up and participated. Really appreciate it. I think this is really just a very preliminary conversation in what is a very, very exciting body of research that has implications far beyond CINDs because of, you know, almost everything is implicated in autonomic function. And so I hope this has been of interest to people. You'll notice on the right that I have a link, that I have a WhatsApp group that shall be turning into a community shortly, where we're convening people with personal interests and research interests. I think the benefit of making this a community will be that it will allow different group chats, and therefore I'm hoping to create one for researchers specifically to discuss this area. We've already got quite a few people on there, and yeah, please feel free to join via the QR code. You can do that with just your camera. If you flash it over, it should take you to the link. So yeah, thank you everyone so much for joining. I really appreciate you taking the time to discuss this area of research, and look forward to talking about this with you all again in future. Thank you very much, guys. Have a
Thanks,
lovely
Jono.
evening. Enjoy
Props,
the
man.
good weather.